Black woman marries a rich judge. Her family disapproves, but later comes to regret it. Welcome, my family, to your very own channel. This is a space where we share stories, laughter, inspiration, and love together. Let's embark on this amazing journey as one big family. Welcome home. Dawn painted the New York skyline in watercolor hues of rose and gold as Ellie Sotomayor stood before her mirror, adjusting her cream silk blouse for the 7th time. Her fingers trembled slightly as they smoothed non-existent wrinkles from her charcoal pencil skirt. At 32, she was finally stepping into the hallowed halls of the New York Supreme Court, not as a visitor or paralegal, but as a law clerk, to none other than the renowned Judge Ruth Antonin Ginsburg. The morning air held the crisp promise of autumn as Ellie emerged from her modest apartment in Queens, clutching both her leather portfolio and her dreams close to her heart. The weight of sacrifice and determination rode with her on the subway. 6 years of night classes, countless cups of coffee, and the gentle encouragement of her aging parents who'd never quite understood why their daughter couldn't be content with her stable job at the bank. "Misha," her mother had said just last night, pressing a small golden medallion of St. Thomas More into her palm. "You carry our hopes with you." The patron saint of lawyers now rested against her collarbone, a constant reminder of the path that had led her here. The courthouse rose before her like a temple of justice, its limestone facade glowing in the morning light. Ellie paused at the bottom of the sweeping stairs, taking in the magnificent Corinthian columns and the words etched above them. Equal justice under law. Her heart quickened as she ascended, each step bringing her closer to the culmination of her dreams. Inside, the marble halls echoed with purpose. Attorneys in tailored suits strode purposefully past, their leather briefcases swinging in rhythm with their confident steps. A young public defender rushed by, his arms full of files, offering Ellie a sympathetic smile, as if recognizing a kindred spirit. The security guard, an elderly gentleman with kind eyes and silver hair, checked her newly minted credentials. "First day, counselor?" he asked warmly, handing back her ID. "Judge Ginsburg's chambers are on the 4th floor. Milton's been running that elevator since before I started here. He'll take good care of you." Milton proved to be a dapper gentleman in his 70s, operating the brass-caged elevator with the precision of an artist. "4th floor for Judge Ginsburg?" he asked, his eyes twinkling. "You must be the new clerk. Marcus has been buzzing about your credentials all week." The elevator's gentle ascent gave Ellie precious moments to compose herself, breathing in the subtle scent of lemon polish and aged wood that permeated the historic building. Milton hummed softly, something that sounded like an old Cole Porter tune, as they rose past floors dedicated to the pursuit of justice. The 4th floor opened to a quieter world. Thick carpeting muffled footsteps, and the walls were lined with portraits of judges past, their stern faces watching over the proceedings with painted gravity. Ellie's heels sank slightly into the deep burgundy carpet as she made her way down the hushed corridor, past mahogany doors bearing golden nameplates, until she reached the one she sought. Honorable Ruth Antonin Ginsburg. A desk outside the chamber doors was occupied by a man who could only be Marcus Washington. His reputation had preceded him. The judge's secretary was legendary throughout the courthouse for his wit, wisdom, and the stunning collection of bow ties that had become his trademark. Today's selection was a jaunty, polka-dotted number in shades of purple and gold. Marcus looked up from his computer screen, his warm brown eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "Well, well," he said, standing to greet her with an elegant flourish. "You must be our Ellie Sotomayor, Harvard Law, class of 2023, editor of the Law Review and, if my sources are correct, makes a mean arroz con gandules." Ellie felt her tension ease slightly at his friendly demeanor. Your sources are thorough, she replied with a small smile. Honey, in this building I am the source, Marcus said with a conspiratorial wink. He adjusted his bow tie and lowered his voice. Now, fair warning, our beloved judge is in quite a state this morning. The Italian coffee maker he's had since his days as a prosecutor finally gave up the ghost, and he's been nursing a cup of break-room coffee that tastes like it was filtered through a gym sock. A crash from within the chambers punctuated Marcus's words, followed by what sounded suspiciously like muffled cursing in multiple languages. Marcus didn't even flinch. That would be the third attempt to resurrect said coffee maker, he explained cheerfully. Judge Ginsburg believes anything can be fixed with enough determination and the right application of constitutional law. Ellie's eyes widened as another crash echoed from behind the heavy doors. Marcus rose gracefully from his desk, straightening his impeccable charcoal suit. Perhaps this would be a good time for me to introduce you. Nothing distracts the judge from a crisis like a new intellectual challenge, and your thesis on comparative constitutional law might just do the trick. As Marcus reached for the door handle, Ellie took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. The medallion of St. Thomas More felt warm against her skin, and she touched it briefly for courage. This was the moment she'd worked towards for so long, her chance to prove herself in the highest levels of the legal world. Marcus paused with his hand on the door, turning to her with an unexpectedly serious expression. "One more thing, dear heart," he said softly. "The judge may seem intimidating at first. Brilliant minds often do. But beneath all that legal genius beats a heart of pure gold. Just be yourself. That's all anyone can ask." With that, he pushed open the heavy door, and Ellie stepped forward into her future, unaware that she was walking into a story far more complex and beautiful than any legal precedent she'd studied. Behind the desk, surrounded by towers of legal books and the remains of what had once been an expensive coffee maker, sat the man who would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone in their orbit. Judge Ruth Antonin Ginsburg looked up from the mechanical carnage before him, his silver hair slightly disheveled, his penetrating dark eyes sharp behind his reading glasses. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, as past and future hung in perfect balance. Then Marcus cleared his throat with theatrical precision. "Your Honor," he announced with a flourish, "may I present Miss Ellie Sotomayor, your new clerk? And might I suggest that before we proceed with introductions, I send down to Vittorio's for a proper cappuccino. I believe we could all use a civilized cup of coffee before diving into the Watson brief." The judge's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly as he took in the scene. His trusted secretary's barely concealed amusement, the eager young clerk standing tall despite her obvious nervousness, and the smoking remains of his beloved coffee maker. Finally, he allowed himself a small smile. "Welcome to Chambers, Miss Sotomayor," he said, his voice deep and cultured. "I trust you're prepared to begin with some rather complex constitutional questions." Ellie felt her legal training kick in, steadying her nerves. "Always, Your Honor," she replied with quiet confidence. "Excellent." The judge nodded approvingly. "Then let us start with this. In a world of seemingly infinite legal complexity, how does one properly dispose of a coffee maker that has provided 15 years of faithful service?" Marcus stifled a laugh as he slipped out to rescue them all with proper coffee. And so began Ellie's first day in Chambers, unaware that down the street at that very moment, Dr. Maya Johnson was preparing for surgery, equally unaware that her path would soon intersect with theirs in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, justice, and the delicate balance between them. Chapter 2. Unexpected Connections. The St. Augustine Memorial Hospital's annual fundraising gala transformed the austere grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel into a shimmering wonderland. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across the sea of evening wear below, where New York's medical and legal elite mingled like schools of exotic fish in a coral reef of silk, satin, and carefully cultivated social connections. Dr. Maya Johnson stood at the edge of the crowd, a vision in a midnight blue evening gown that seemed to catch and hold the light. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had fought her way to the top of her field. As head of neurosurgery, she'd performed operations that others deemed impossible, earned accolades that lined her office walls, and yet tonight she felt strangely vulnerable. Dr. Johnson! A young resident hurried over, nearly spilling his champagne in his excitement. The board members can't stop talking about your latest paper on innovative approaches to brain tumor removal. Dr. Richardson specifically asked if you'd join their table. Maya suppressed a sigh. These galas were a necessary part of her position. Networking, securing donations, playing the delicate game of hospital politics. She'd rather be in her operating room, where success was measured in saved lives rather than raised eyebrows and subtle social cues. "Tell them I'll be there shortly," she said with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I need to review my presentation notes." It wasn't entirely a lie. As the hospital's star neurosurgeon, she would be introducing the keynote speaker, the Honorable Judge Ruth Antonin Ginsburg, whose recent ruling on medical liability reform had sent waves through the healthcare community. Maya had read the ruling 3 times, admiring its elegant reasoning and careful balance of competing interests. The ballroom's soft lighting caught the subtle auburn highlights in her expertly twisted updo as she made her way to a quiet corner. Her younger sister Jasmine, a fashion designer who'd insisted on selecting her gown for the evening, had been right about the dress. Its sophisticated cut and deep color made her feel both powerful and feminine, though Maya had drawn the line at the diamond choker Jasmine had tried to loan her. "Dr. Johnson," a familiar voice made her turn. Marcus Washington stood there, resplendent in a tuxedo with an artfully tied midnight blue bow tie that perfectly matched her gown. "I thought that was you. You're looking absolutely radiant tonight." Maya's genuine smile broke through her professional mask. She'd known Marcus for years. He'd been her patient's husband during her residency, and they'd stayed in touch. His wit and warmth had helped her through many challenging days. "Marcus, I had no idea you'd be here tonight, though I should have guessed. Anywhere important legal and medical minds meet, you're sure to be orchestrating something." He laughed, the sound rich and conspiratorial. "Guilty as charged. I'm here with Judge Ginsburg, of course. Speaking of whom—" Marcus glanced over her shoulder, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Fair warning, dear. He's headed this way, and he's already asked me twice who the stunning doctor in blue is." Before Maya could process this information, she heard another voice, deep and cultured, with just a hint of a Brooklyn accent that years of judicial gravitas hadn't entirely erased. "Marcus, are you monopolizing the most interesting person in the room?" Maya turned to find herself face to face with Judge Ruth Antonin Ginsburg. Photos hadn't done him justice. At 55, he carried his years with distinguished grace. Silver temples framed dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through social pretense to the heart of things. His bow tie, clearly chosen by Marcus, was a subtle pattern of scales of justice in silver on midnight blue. "Your Honor," Maya said, extending her hand, "I'm Dr. Maya Johnson, head of neurosurgery. I'll be introducing you tonight." His hand was warm and strong as it clasped hers. "Dr. Johnson, your reputation precedes you. I've followed your work on minimally invasive surgical techniques. In fact, I cited your research in my recent opinion on medical technology patents." Maya felt a spark of professional excitement. "The Merrick case? Your analysis of the balance between patent protection and medical accessibility was brilliant." "You've read my opinions?" His eyebrows rose slightly, interest kindling in his dark eyes. I make it a point to stay informed on legal decisions affecting medical practice, Maya replied, though I must admit, your writing style makes even complex legal reasoning surprisingly engaging. Marcus, watching this exchange with barely concealed delight, somehow materialized 2 glasses of champagne. Perhaps you'd like to continue this discussion somewhere a bit quieter. The garden terrace is lovely this time of year. They found themselves in the hotel's meticulously maintained terrace garden, where the early autumn air carried the sweet scent of late-blooming roses. New York's lights sparkled beyond the terrace's ornate railing, creating an intimate bubble of calm above the city's eternal bustle. "I hope you don't mind the temporary escape," Ruth said, his judicial formality softening slightly in the garden's privacy. Large gatherings like this, they serve their purpose, but meaningful conversation becomes difficult. Maya understood completely. "It's like performing surgery with an audience," she said. "Sometimes you need to clear the gallery to focus on what matters." He smiled at the medical metaphor. "Precisely, though I imagine brain surgery requires considerably more skill than listening to lawyers argue." "I don't know about that," Maya found herself saying. "We both hold lives in our hands, in our own ways. One wrong decision, and everything changes," he finished softly. Their eyes met in a moment of perfect understanding. The garden's fairy lights twinkled above them like stars as they talked. Maya found herself sharing stories about challenging cases, the joy of teaching young residents, the weight of decisions that could change lives forever. Ruth spoke of his own challenges, balancing justice with law, protecting rights while maintaining order, the loneliness of being the final arbiter in impossible situations. Time seemed to flow differently in their private garden sanctuary. Maya discovered that beneath the judge's serious exterior lay a dry wit and passionate intellect that matched her own. Ruth found himself captivated by her brilliant mind and the compassion that drove her to push medical boundaries. Inside the ballroom, Marcus expertly deflected inquiries about their whereabouts, a satisfied smile playing at his lips. He'd known somehow, from the moment he saw them in the same room. Sometimes, he mused, justice and healing needed to work hand in hand. When they finally returned for Ruth's keynote address, something had shifted in the universe. Maya watched from her seat as he commanded the podium, his words weaving a vision of justice and healthcare working together to serve humanity. His eyes found hers in the crowd more than once, and each time that spark of connection grew stronger. Later, as the gala wound down and the city's lights burned ever brighter beyond the ballroom's windows, Ruth offered to call Maya a car. Instead, they found themselves walking through the cool Manhattan night, talking about everything and nothing. Favorite books, childhood dreams, the best pizza in Brooklyn, the weight of responsibilities that came with their chosen paths. At the corner where they would part ways, Ruth paused. "Dr. Johnson, Maya," he said, his voice carrying a note she hadn't heard before. "Would you consider having dinner with me sometime? Perhaps somewhere quieter than a hospital gala?" The city seemed to hold its breath. Maya looked at this man who had suddenly appeared in her carefully ordered life, bringing with him possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. "I'd like that," she said simply. As she watched his car pull away, Maya touched her mother's cherished pearl earrings, her good luck charm through countless surgeries. Tonight, standing on a Manhattan street corner in a midnight blue gown, she had a feeling she'd need a different kind of luck altogether. Back in his apartment, Ruth loosened his bow tie and looked out over the city lights. On his desk, a stack of briefs awaited his attention, but for once they could wait. He thought of Maya's brilliant smile, her insightful questions, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about saving lives. Marcus had been right. Sometimes the most important connections happened when you least expected them. Neither of them could have known then how their worlds would collide and merge, how their professional respect would bloom into something deeper, or how their love would challenge not only their own preconceptions, but those of everyone around them. But standing there in the autumn night, they had both felt it, the first tremors of a seismic shift that would change everything. Chapter 3. Family Ties. The aroma of Patricia Johnson's famous Sunday pot roast filled the historic brownstone in Harlem that had been in the family for 3 generations. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows that Grandma Rose had installed in 1963, casting rainbow patterns across the well-worn hardwood floors. Every Sunday, without fail, the Johnson family gathered here for dinner, a tradition as unshakable as the foundations of the house itself. Maya stood in her childhood kitchen, methodically chopping carrots for her mother's signature recipe. The familiar rhythm of the knife against the cutting board usually brought her comfort, but today her hands trembled slightly. After 3 months of dating Ruth, it was time to tell her family. The weight of the secret had become too heavy to bear, especially given the whispers already circulating through their social circles. "Baby girl, those carrots are going to be dust if you keep at them like that," Patricia Johnson said, gently taking the knife from her daughter's hands. At 65, Patricia remained a striking figure, her silver-streaked hair wrapped in an elegant head wrap that matched her African print dress. Her keen, dark eyes missed nothing. "What's troubling you?" Maya took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar sense of home. Herbs from her mother's window garden, the sweet potato pie cooling on the windowsill, decades of love and history soaked into these walls. "Mama, I need to tell you something, but I want to wait until everyone's here." Patricia's hands stilled on the pot roast she was seasoning. "Maya Elizabeth Johnson, I've known you were hiding something for weeks now. A mother knows." She turned to face her daughter fully. "You're practically glowing these days, but you've been avoiding my questions about why. I'm assuming there's a man involved." Before Maya could respond, the front door burst open with a gust of autumn air and loud voices. James, her younger brother, entered first, his lawyer's briefcase stuffed with papers he probably intended to work on after dinner. Behind him came their father, Reverend Marcus Johnson Sr., still in his Sunday preaching clothes, Bible tucked under his arm. Their sister Rachel followed, herding her twin 10-year-old boys who were arguing about their latest soccer match. "Something smells amazing, Mama," James called out, dropping his briefcase by the stairs. At 35, he was the youngest partner at his civil rights law firm, and his sharp intelligence shone in eyes identical to Maya's. He kissed his mother's cheek, then gave Maya a knowing look. "So, sis, any special announcements today?" Maya's head snapped up. James raised his hands in surrender. "Hey, the legal community talks, and I may have seen you and a certain distinguished judge having dinner at Salvatore's last week." Patricia's wooden spoon clattered against the counter. "Judge? What judge?" "Perhaps we should all sit down," Reverend Johnson suggested quietly. His deep voice, trained by 40 years of preaching, carried the weight of authority even in its gentlest tones. He'd been unusually silent since arriving, watching his eldest daughter with concerned eyes. The family migrated to the dining room, where the big mahogany table that had hosted 4 decades of Sunday dinners waited. Rachel's twins were dispatched to the kitchen to fetch water glasses, their bickering temporarily forgotten in the face of adult tension. Maya remained standing, her fingers tracing the carved edge of her grandmother's china cabinet for strength. These pieces of furniture had witnessed so much family history, celebrations, arguments, reconciliations. Now they would witness this moment too. "I've been seeing someone," she began, her surgeon's steady hands now clasped tightly together. "It's serious. His name is Ruth Antonin Ginsburg, and he's a federal judge." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel's twins, returning with the water glasses, froze in the doorway, sensing the tension. A judge? Patricia's voice was barely a whisper, then louder with rising disbelief. A judge? Baby girl, have you lost your mind? After everything our people have been through in those courtrooms, Maya had expected this reaction, had rehearsed her responses, but the actual moment still struck like a physical blow. Mama, Ruth is different. His record on civil rights. His record? Patricia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I don't care about his record. I care about my daughter. Do you know what your grandfather would say? He spent his life fighting against a system that... That's exactly what Ruth fights against too. Maya's voice rose to match her mother's. He's one of the most progressive judges on the bench. His recent ruling on police reform... James slammed his fork down, the sharp sound cutting through the tension. Mom, it's 2024, not 1964. Maya's right about Judge Ginsburg. I've appeared in his courtroom. His decisions consistently support equal justice under law. Progressive doesn't mean he understands our struggles, Reverend Johnson said quietly, speaking for the first time. His eyes, lined with decades of witnessing both progress and setbacks in the fight for equality, fixed on his daughter. Maya, you're a respected surgeon. You could have anyone. I don't want anyone, Daddy, Maya said softly. I want him. Rachel, who had been silent until now, reached for her sister's hand. How long have you been seeing him? 3 months, Maya answered, grateful for the simple question. We met at the hospital fundraising gala. He was the keynote speaker. 3 months? Patricia's voice rose again. You've been keeping this from us for 3 months? Because I knew you'd react exactly like this. Maya felt tears threatening, but blinked them back. A lifetime of being the strong one, the achiever, the one who never showed weakness, held them in check. I'm 38 years old, Mama. I've spent my whole life making you proud. Straight A's, medical school, chief of neurosurgery. When do I get to make choices for my own happiness? Happiness, Patricia laughed bitterly. You think it'll be happiness when you're getting strange looks at the country club? When his family treats you like an outsider? When your children... Patricia. Reverend Johnson's quiet voice cut through his wife's tirade. That's enough. The twins had long since disappeared upstairs, but their muffled footsteps could be heard overhead, pacing with the nervous energy of children sensing adult distress. James stood, straightening his suit jacket with the same gesture he used in court. Look, I've got something to say. I've watched Maya sacrifice everything for her career, for this family's reputation. Judge Ginsburg is a good man. His decisions show a deep understanding of systemic inequality and a commitment to justice. If Maya has found someone who matches her intellect and shares her values, isn't that what we should want for her? Values? Patricia's voice cracked. What about our family's values, our history? Our family's values are love, justice, and courage, Reverend Johnson said, standing slowly. Maya has always exemplified those values in everything she does. He moved to the china cabinet, opening it carefully to remove an old photograph. It showed his own parents on their wedding day in 1950, standing proud despite the disapproval they'd faced. A dark-skinned man marrying a lighter-skinned woman when such things caused scandal even within their own community. Your grandmother taught me that love doesn't follow rules made by others, he said softly, placing the photo on the table. She taught me that justice means fighting against prejudice in all its forms, including our own. Maya felt tears sliding down her cheeks now, unable to hold them back at the sight of her grandparents' photo. Her grandfather had been the one to first spark her interest in medicine, showing her his war medic kit, teaching her about healing. Patricia stared at the photo for a long moment, then sank back into her chair, her own eyes glistening. "I just want to protect you," she whispered. "The world is still so hard, baby girl." "I know, Mama." Maya moved to kneel beside her mother's chair. "But Ruth makes it less hard. He sees me, not just Dr. Johnson, not just a black woman, but me. And I see him, not just Judge Ginsburg, but a man who believes in justice so deeply that he's devoted his life to it." Rachel's voice cut through the emotional tension. "Well, I want to meet him, properly. Bring him to Sunday dinner next week." "Next week?" Patricia's head snapped up. "I need more time to—" "To what, Mama? To adjust? To remember that you raised us to judge people by their character and not their color? In either direction?" James asked gently. The sound of the twins thundering back downstairs broke the tension. They burst into the dining room, brandishing their phones. "Mom, Grandma, look what we found! Judge Ginsburg gave a speech at our school last year about Martin Luther King Jr. Day. He quoted great-grandpa's civil rights writings." The adults stared at the video playing on the phone, Ruth standing before a group of middle school students, earnestly discussing the importance of continuing the fight for true equality, citing the words of Maya's grandfather, a lesser-known but significant civil rights activist. Patricia watched the video, her expression unreadable. Finally she stood, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. "The pot roast is getting cold," she said quietly. "Maya, set another place for next Sunday. Your young man should know that dinner starts promptly at 3. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. But it was a beginning. Maya helped her mother serve dinner, the familiar ritual comforting in its normalcy. As they ate, conversation gradually returned to its usual patterns: Rachel's boys' soccer tournament, James's latest case, church business. But underneath it all, change was brewing. Like the subtle shift of tectonic plates before a quake, the Johnson family's foundations were being tested, forced to expand and adapt. Whether they would crack or grow stronger remained to be seen. Later that night, as Maya prepared to leave, her father pulled her aside in his study. The room smelled of old books and the pipe he'd given up smoking years ago. "Maya," he said softly, "are you sure about this? Really sure?" She thought of Ruth's passionate commitment to justice, his gentle humor, the way his eyes lit up when she talked about her work. She thought of their long conversations about faith, ethics, and the responsibility they both felt to make the world better. "I'm sure, Daddy," she answered. "He makes me feel like anything is possible." Reverend Johnson nodded slowly, then reached for his worn Bible. From between its pages, he pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping, a photo of his own father marching for justice. "Then you'll need all the strength our family has to offer," he said, pressing the clipping into her hand. "Because love like that, it's revolutionary, and revolutions are never easy." Chapter 4. Office Politics. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows of Judge Ginsburg's chambers, casting long shadows across leather-bound law books and case files. At 11:30 on a Thursday night, the courthouse had long since emptied of its daily bustle, leaving behind only the whispered echoes of justice sought and rendered. Well, those echoes, and Ellie Sotomayor, still at her desk, surrounded by towers of briefs and legal precedents. The soft glow of her desk lamp created a small island of light in the darkness. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed, too engrossed in perfecting her analysis of a complex constitutional issue the judge had assigned her. Her dark hair had escaped its usually pristine bun, and her heels lay discarded under her desk, casualties of another late night at the office. "I thought I might find you here." Marcus's voice drifted from the doorway, carrying its usual warmth tinged with concern. He wore a jewel-toned bow tie that somehow managed to look fresh, despite the late hour. "You know, most law clerks occasionally go home to sleep." Ellie looked up, blinking away the ghost. images of legal text that seemed burned into her retinas. "I just need to finish this analysis. The judge wanted it for tomorrow's." The judge wanted a preliminary review, not a doctoral dissertation. Marcus interrupted gently, placing a fragrant cup of his famous lavender tea on her desk. "Though I suspect this sudden burst of midnight oil has less to do with constitutional law and more to do with a certain neurosurgeon who's been brightening our judge's mood lately." Ellie's hand stilled on her keyboard. 2 months had passed since Judge Ginsburg began dating Dr. Maya Johnson, and the change in him was unmistakable. His stern demeanor had softened, replaced by an almost boyish enthusiasm. He hummed in his chambers, brought fresh pastries for the staff, and somehow managed to make even the most complex legal arguments sound like love poems. "I just want everything to be perfect," Ellie said quietly, wrapping her hands around the warm teacup. "The Anderson case is complicated, and with the media attention—" "Honey?" Marcus settled into the chair across from her desk, his dark eyes kind but knowing. "I've been running this office longer than you've been practicing law. I know deflection when I see it." The tea's soothing aroma filled the space between them, creating an intimate bubble in the vast darkness of the chambers. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, a reminder of the city that never slept, even as they sat in this moment of truth. "Is it that obvious?" Ellie finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Only to someone who's watched enough courthouse drama to write a soap opera," Marcus replied, adjusting his bow tie thoughtfully. "You know, I was here when the judge first took the bench, watched him build his reputation case by case, precedent by precedent. Everyone expected him to be just another privileged voice maintaining the status quo, but he surprised them all." Ellie nodded, remembering the cases she'd studied in law school, Ginsburg opinions that had quietly revolutionized various areas of law. "He sees things others miss," she said softly. "Connections, implications, the human element behind the legal theory." "Rather like a brilliant young clerk, I know," Marcus observed, "who's currently trying to bury her feelings under a mountain of legal briefs." The truth of his words hit Ellie like a physical force. She'd spent months trying to ignore the flutter in her chest when the judge praised her work, the way her day brightened when he asked her opinion on a case, how she'd memorized the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. "It doesn't matter," she said firmly, straightening papers that didn't need straightening. "He's my mentor, my boss. And now he's with Dr. Johnson, who's absolutely brilliant and accomplished and perfect for him." "Ah, yes, our Maya," Marcus smiled fondly. "A force of nature, that one. Did you know she once performed emergency brain surgery in the middle of a blackout, used her phone's flashlight until the generators kicked in?" Ellie's heart sank further. How could she compete with someone like that? Not that she was competing. Not that she would ever compete. "They're wonderful together," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "The way they discuss the intersection of medical ethics and legal theory. It's like watching a masterclass in intellectual discourse." Marcus hummed thoughtfully. "And you've been working twice as hard since they started dating, staying later, taking on extra cases. Burning the midnight oil won't change what's in your heart, dear one." Tears pricked at Ellie's eyes, but she blinked them back. "I just need to focus on my work. This clerkship is the opportunity of a lifetime. I won't let personal feelings interfere." Marcus reached across the desk to cover her hand with his. "You know what my grandmother used to say? The heart feels what it feels. Trying to reason with it is like trying to teach a cat to bark. The question is, what are you going to do with those feelings?" Before Ellie could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway, the distinctive rhythm of the judge's walk. She quickly wiped her eyes and straightened her blouse as Judge Ginsburg appeared in the doorway, his silver hair slightly disheveled, his tie loosened after a long day of oral arguments. "Burning the midnight oil again, Miss Sotomayor?" he asked, his voice carrying that warm tone it had developed since meeting Maya. "I hope you're not still working on the Anderson analysis." "Just finishing up, Your Honor," Ellie replied smoothly, years of professional training hiding the tremor in her heart. "Excellent work as always, but don't stay too late. We need your sharp mind fresh for tomorrow's proceedings." He smiled, that brilliant, transformative smile that had become more frequent lately. "Maya's joining us for lunch tomorrow. She's fascinated by your analysis of medical liability precedents. I believe she called your writing surgically precise." Ellie managed to smile. "Dr. Johnson is too kind. I look forward to it." After the judge retrieved a forgotten brief from his chambers and bid them good night, Marcus turned back to Ellie with understanding in his eyes. "You know what else my grandmother used to say? Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let go of what we want and celebrate what brings others joy." Ellie looked down at her legal pad, covered in her neat handwriting. Arguments and counter-arguments, each point carefully crafted to meet the exacting standards of the man she'd grown to admire as both a jurist and a human being. "Your grandmother sounds very wise." She was. Marcus stood, straightening his bow tie in the window's reflection. "She also said that time heals all wounds, but a good cup of tea and a friend to share it with can speed up the process considerably." The city lights twinkled beyond the courthouse windows like stars fallen to earth. Ellie thought about all the dreams that had led her here. The long nights of study, the sacrifices, the determination to make her mark in the legal world. She hadn't planned on falling in love with her mentor, hadn't expected the complicated emotions that now colored her professional achievement. "I don't know how to stop feeling this way," she admitted quietly. "Oh, honey," Marcus's voice was gentle. "You don't have to stop feeling. You just have to choose what to do with those feelings. And from what I've seen, you excel at channeling emotional energy into exceptional legal work." He was right, of course. The past months of hidden heartache had produced some of her finest legal writing. Each brief was a love letter she could never send, each argument a testament to everything she admired about Ruth Antonin Ginsburg. His brilliance, his integrity, his unwavering commitment to justice. "Tell you what," Marcus said, gathering her coat from the rack. "Tomorrow, after the lunch that you will handle with perfect professional grace, you and I are going to that little Italian place around the corner. You can tell me all about the fascinating constitutional implications of the Anderson case, and I'll pretend not to notice if you need to cry into your pasta." Ellie felt a genuine smile break through her melancholy. "You're a good friend, Marcus." "The best," he agreed cheerfully. "Now let's get you home. Even the most brilliant legal minds need sleep, and that tea is getting cold." As they walked through the darkened courthouse corridors, their footsteps echoing off marble floors, Ellie thought about the complexity of love, how it could be both a source of pain and a catalyst for growth, how it could make you stronger, even as it broke your heart. The next morning she would return to these halls, ready to face another day of watching the man she loved fall deeper in love with someone else. She would pour her heart into her work, contribute to the cause of justice, and learn to find joy in being part of something larger than her own feelings. After all, she reflected as they stepped into the cool night air, isn't that what love truly meant? Not just the passion and the longing, but the wisdom to know when to step aside, the strength to celebrate another's happiness, the courage to keep moving forward. Marcus hailed a taxi, his bow tie catching the streetlight like a jewel. "Remember," he said as he opened the car door for her, "tomorrow is another day, and you, my dear, are stronger than you know." Ellie settled into the taxi's back seat, clutching her briefcase like a shield. Through the window, she watched the courthouse recede into the night, that temple of justice where she'd found her calling, lost her heart, and was now learning the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes love meant letting go. Chapter 5. The Proposal. The evening was perfect, almost too perfect. Ruth Antonin Ginsburg stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting his bow tie for the 7th time. Marcus had selected it specially for the occasion. Midnight blue silk with tiny silver constellations, a reflection of the night sky under which he planned to propose. "Your Honor," Marcus called from the living room of Ruth's Upper West Side apartment, "if you adjust that tie one more time, you'll wear a hole in it. And may I remind you it's from my personal collection?" Ruth emerged from the bathroom, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "Everything has to be perfect, Marcus. The reservations at Per Se, the string quartet I hired to play our song, the ring—" His eyes widened suddenly. "The ring is exactly where it's been for the past week, in your desk drawer at Chambers, which I personally locked before we left," Marcus assured him, straightening his own matching bow tie. "Now, shall we go through the plan one more time?" The plan was indeed meticulous, as befitting a federal judge known for his attention to detail. Per Se had arranged a private dining room overlooking Central Park. The string quartet would begin playing At Last, the song that had been playing during their first dance at the hospital charity gala, just as dessert arrived. The ring, a vintage Art Deco piece that had belonged to Ruth's grandmother, would be presented on a bed of rose petals. Ruth had even prepared a speech, though he'd rewritten it 17 times. What Ruth hadn't planned for was Maya's cousin Jasmine. Jasmine Johnson, fashion designer and self-proclaimed family watchdog, had overheard Maya's assistant mentioning the Per Se reservation while scheduling around a surgery. One quick call to her contact in the restaurant industry had revealed the private dining room booking and the string quartet request. Her natural talent for connecting dots did the rest, which is why, as Ruth and Marcus pulled up to the restaurant in their town car, they found themselves face to face with what appeared to be half of the extended Johnson family, attempting to appear casual while loitering near the entrance. "Oh no," Marcus muttered, spotting Jasmine's distinctive silver-streaked dreadlocks. "We have a situation, Your Honor." Ruth's face paled slightly. Is that Reverend Johnson and Patricia? And is that Maya's great-aunt Beatrice from Atlanta?" Indeed it was. Great-aunt Beatrice, aged 87 and still sharp as a tack, had insisted on flying in when Jasmine called with her suspicions. "I was there when her grandmother got engaged," she declared. "I'm not missing this." Marcus's mind worked quickly. "Okay, don't panic. We can salvage this. Maybe we can—" But it was too late. Maya's town car was pulling up to the curb. What happened next could only be described as choreographed chaos. Maya emerged from her car, stunning in a deep purple evening gown, and froze at the sight of her family. Ruth stepped forward to greet her, nearly tripping over Maya's nephew, who was attempting to hide behind a potted plant with his phone camera ready. Jasmine tried to shush Great-Aunt Beatrice, who was loudly proclaiming that the ring better be at least as nice as the one Maya's grandmother had turned down from that doctor in 1952. What is everyone doing here?" Maya managed to ask, her professional composure slipping for perhaps the first time in her career. Ruth opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by the arrival of the string quartet, who chose that exact moment to begin playing At Last on the sidewalk, having been blocked from entering by the growing crowd of Johnson family members. Marcus, ever the master of impossible situations, stepped in. "Well, this is certainly festive. Perhaps we should all—" He was interrupted by the arrival of 2 more cars. From the first emerged James, Maya's brother, apologizing profusely. "I tried to stop them, I swear." From the second came Ruth's sister Rachel and his niece Sarah, the latter clutching what appeared to be a wedding-planning binder. "The judge's family too," Jasmine exclaimed. "Oh, this is better than Fashion Week." Maya turned to Ruth, her eyes wide. Was this supposed to be—" Ruth looked at the chaos around them, the string quartet valiantly playing on, the family members trying and failing to appear inconspicuous, Marcus attempting to prevent Great-Aunt Beatrice from interrogating the maitre d' about the wine list. This was not the perfect moment he'd planned. This was not the carefully scripted scene he'd imagined. And yet, "My chambers," he said suddenly. "What?" Maya blinked. "Everyone," Ruth's judicial voice cut through the chaos. "I suggest we relocate to my chambers at the courthouse." Marcus caught on immediately. "Yes! Excellent idea, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would all be so kind as to follow us. I believe Vittorio's can handle a last-minute catering order." And so it was that an unlikely procession made its way to the New York Supreme Court building. A federal judge, a neurosurgeon, their combined families, a string quartet, and Marcus bringing up the rear while making rapid calls to his extensive network of catering contacts. The marble halls of justice had never seen anything quite like it. The string quartet's music soared to the vaulted ceilings, their melody bouncing off portraits of stern-faced judges past. Great-Aunt Beatrice declared that the courthouse's architecture was almost as impressive as the Fox Theatre in Atlanta, which from her was high praise indeed. In Ruth's chambers, where so many landmark decisions had been crafted, where justice had been carefully weighed and measured, a different kind of history was about to be made. The late evening light filtered through the tall windows, casting a golden glow over the assembled families. Ruth stood before his desk, where he had spent countless hours poring over briefs and crafting opinions. Maya stood before him, her eyes shining with understanding and love. Their families crowded around. Patricia and Reverend Johnson, Ruth's sister Rachel, cousins, nieces, nephews, and Great-Aunt Beatrice in a place of honor near the front. Marcus had somehow managed to transform the chambers in record time. Candles, battery-operated, in deference to courthouse regulations, flickered on every surface. The string quartet had settled into a corner, playing softly. Even Vittorio himself had arrived with an array of elegant appetizers. "This wasn't how I planned this," Ruth began, taking Maya's hands in his. "I had a speech prepared, 17 versions of it, actually. But standing here in these chambers where I have sought justice for so many years, surrounded by our families—" He paused, emotion making his voice rough. "I realize that sometimes the most perfect moments are the ones we don't plan." Maya squeezed his hands, tears sparkling in her eyes. "Maya Elizabeth Johnson," Ruth continued, "you walked into my life and showed me that there is more to justice than what we find in law books. You taught me that love is the highest form of justice, the recognition that two souls belong together, regardless of what society might say." He reached into his desk drawer, which Marcus had indeed remembered to unlock, and withdrew a small velvet box. Great-Aunt Beatrice leaned forward so eagerly that James had to catch her arm to keep her from toppling over. Dropping to one knee, with considerably more grace than a man his age might be expected to possess, Ruth opened the box to reveal a stunning Art Deco ring, its diamonds catching the golden light. "Will you marry me? Will you help me create a new kind of justice, one based on love, understanding, and the belief that two people from different worlds can build a bridge between them?" The string quartet held their bows still. The assembled families seemed to collectively hold their breath. Even Marcus paused in his orchestration of the impromptu celebration. Maya looked around the chambers, at their families, at the law books lining the walls, at the man kneeling before her who had not only chosen to love her, but had embraced everything that came with that love, including an entire extended family crashing his carefully planned proposal. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing with joy and certainty. 1,000 times yes. The chambers erupted in cheers. The string quartet burst into a triumphant rendition of "At Last." Great Aunt Beatrice declared the ring almost as nice as the one the doctor had in 1952, her highest form of approval. As Ruth slipped the ring onto Maya's finger, Marcus dabbed at his eyes with a constellation-patterned handkerchief that perfectly matched the proposal bow ties. "Sometimes," he murmured to no one in particular, "justice and love are exactly the same thing." Patricia Johnson found herself standing next to Ruth's sister Rachel, both of them watching their siblings embrace. "I suppose we're family now," Patricia said softly. Rachel smiled, offering Patricia a tissue from her purse. "Family is just justice of the heart," she replied. "Or at least, that's what my brother always says." Later, as Vittorio's staff served champagne in paper cups, glass being against courthouse regulations, Ruth and Maya stood by the windows, looking out over the city they both served in their different ways. "I had a whole evening planned," Ruth said, shaking his head with amusement. "A speech about how love is like a legal precedent, building on past cases to create new understanding." Maya laughed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "This was better. This was us, all of us, messy and real and full of love." She looked down at her ring, then back at their families mingling in the chambers. "Besides, now we have a story to tell our grandchildren." "Speaking of stories," Marcus approached with a fresh round of champagne, "wait until you hear how many people I had to call to make this impromptu celebration happen. The string quartet was easy, but you wouldn't believe what it took to get Vittorio to close his restaurant and come here personally. As their families celebrated around them, as the music filled the chambers with joy, as the city lights began to twinkle outside like stars fallen to earth, Ruth and Maya held each other close. Sometimes they both realized the most perfect moments are the ones that don't go according to plan. Sometimes justice, like love, requires embracing the beautiful chaos that comes with opening your heart to possibility. Chapter 6. Storm Clouds. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Judge Ginsburg's chambers, casting long shadows across his desk, where an innocent-looking cream envelope lay among the morning's legal briefs. It wasn't the first anonymous letter, and Marcus knew as he held it that it wouldn't be the last. His practiced eye had learned to spot them, no return address, handwritten with deliberate messiness, the paper expensive, but chosen to be untraceable. Marcus slipped on. Pair of latex gloves, a habit he'd developed after the second letter had contained a particularly nasty surprise, and carefully opened the envelope. His face remained impassive as he read, but his bow tie, today's selection a peaceful pattern of doves on lavender silk, seemed to droop slightly. "Another one?" Ellie asked from her desk, where she'd been pretending not to watch. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed another late night of work, but her voice carried only professional concern. Marcus replied, already reaching for the file folder where he kept every letter, photographed and documented. "This one's actually quite creative in its vitriol. They managed to work in both biblical references and statistics about failed interracial marriages, points for thoroughness, if nothing else." The engagement announcement had appeared in the New York Times 3 weeks ago. The Honorable Ruth Antonin Ginsburg, federal judge of the Southern District, to wed Dr. Maya Elizabeth Johnson, chief of neurosurgery at St. Augustine Memorial Hospital. The photograph had shown them looking radiantly happy, their joy seemingly immune to the storm their union had stirred up in certain circles. The responses had been as varied as they were intense. Progressive legal organizations had celebrated it as a symbol of progress. conservative blogs had thinly veiled their disapproval in concerns about judicial objectivity. The hospital board members had taken to cornering Maya after meetings, making subtle suggestions about maintaining appropriate professional distance and considering the hospital's image. But it was the anonymous letters that worried Marcus most. They arrived with increasing frequency, ranging from biblical quotations to thinly veiled threats. He'd started screening Ruth's mail personally, trying to protect both the judge and Maya from the worst of it. "Any actual threats this time?" Ellie asked, her legal training automatically categorizing potential crimes. "Nothing actionable," Marcus sighed, filing the letter away. "Just the usual divine judgment and natural order nonsense, though they did throw in some interesting commentary about the future of the judiciary. I'll add it to the file for the FBI." The soft ding of the elevator announced a visitor, and both Marcus and Ellie straightened instinctively, but it was only James, Maya's brother, his lawyer's briefcase bulging with papers, and his expression troubled. "Marcus," he nodded in greeting. "Is he in?" "Meeting with the chief judge," Marcus replied, already reaching for his phone to text Ruth. "But he should be back soon. Coffee?" James accepted the offered cup, sinking into one of the leather visitors' chairs. His usual sharp appearance was slightly rumpled, as if he'd been up all night. "Maya had another board meeting yesterday," he said without preamble. Marcus and Ellie exchanged glances. They'd all noticed the increasing pressure Maya faced at the hospital, though she rarely complained. "How bad?" Marcus asked quietly. "They're reviewing the leadership structure of the neurosurgery department," James replied, his air quotes dripping with disdain. "Suddenly concerned about potential conflicts of interest now that she's engaged to a federal judge. Never mind that she's performed more successful surgeries than any other department head in the hospital's history." Ellie felt her heart twist. Whatever her complicated feelings about the engagement, she'd grown to deeply respect Maya's brilliant mind and dedication to her patients. "That's ridiculous," she said firmly. "They can't seriously think. They can think whatever they want." Ruth's voice came from the doorway, heavy with contained anger. He'd returned from his meeting early, his judicial robes making him look more than ever like an avenging angel. "The question is, what are they doing?" James stood to greet his future brother-in-law. "Nothing openly discriminatory. They're too smart for that. Just 1,000 little cuts. Questioning her decisions, suggesting she's distracted by wedding planning. Yesterday they assigned her a co-chair for the department, supposedly to help with the workload." Ruth's expression darkened. He'd seen this kind of sophisticated discrimination before, the kind that hid behind policy and procedure, almost impossible to fight in court because it left no clear evidence. "And Maya?" "You know Maya," James smiled sadly. "She's handling it with more grace than they deserve. Stays late, takes extra surgeries, proves herself over and over, but I can see it wearing on her." Marcus watched his old friend carefully. He knew that look in Ruth's eyes, the same look he got before delivering a particularly powerful opinion. "Your Honor," he said cautiously, "whatever you're thinking—" "I'm thinking," Ruth interrupted, "that I need to make some calls. There are several hospital board members who regularly appear before me in corporate cases. Perhaps it's time to review my recusal policies." "Ruth," James said quietly, "that's exactly what they're afraid of. That your position will influence hospital business if you intervene, even indirectly." "Then what?" Ruth demanded, his controlled judicial temperament slipping. "I should stand by while they punish Maya for loving me. Watch them try to push her out of the position she's earned through years of brilliant work." The chamber fell silent. Even the usual courthouse sound seemed muted, as if the very building was holding its breath. "No," Ellie said suddenly, surprising herself, "but you fight it the right way." She stood, moving to the case files she'd been researching. I've been looking into hospital discrimination cases, particularly those involving leadership positions. There's precedent for— Miss Sotomayor, Ruth interrupted gently. I appreciate your dedication, but this isn't a legal matter. Not yet. Everything is a legal matter, Ellie insisted, her voice growing stronger. And more importantly, everything leaves a paper trail. If they're really reviewing the leadership structure, there are documents. If they're questioning her decisions, there are records. If they're treating her differently than other department heads, then we document everything, James finished, his lawyer's mind catching up. Build a case, even if we never use it. Marcus smiled proudly at Ellie. This was why she was such a brilliant clerk. She saw the long game, the careful building of evidence and argument that could change the world one document at a time. The hospital gala is next week, he said thoughtfully. All the board members will be there. Perhaps it's time to remind them that Dr. Johnson has friends in more than just legal circles. Ruth looked at his gathered allies, his brilliant clerk, his loyal secretary, his future brother-in-law, and felt some of his anger transform into determination. Maya would say we're overreacting, he said softly. She believes in winning people over, not fighting them. And that's why we love her, Marcus agreed. But sometimes, while the healers heal, the rest of us need to stand guard. The rest of the day passed in a blur of court proceedings and case reviews. But underneath the normal business, plans were being made. Marcus's network of courthouse contacts began quietly spreading word about the hospital's treatment of their beloved judge's fiancée. Ellie's careful documentation started taking shape in a secure file. James reached out to his civil rights law colleagues for advice and support. That evening, Ruth found Maya in her office at the hospital, reviewing patient files long after her co-chair had gone home. She looked up as he entered, her smile brightening the sterile hospital lighting. I thought I might find you here, he said softly, taking in the subtle signs of strain around her eyes. Just finishing up some paperwork, she replied, but they both knew it was more than that. She was proving herself, as she had been doing her entire career. Ruth moved behind her chair, gently massaging her tired shoulders. You know you don't have to. Yes, I do, she interrupted firmly. I didn't get here by backing down, Ruth. I got here by being twice as good, twice as dedicated, twice as careful. If they want to question my commitment now, I'll show them exactly how committed I am. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, inhaling the subtle scent of her shampoo mixed with hospital antiseptic. You are the strongest person I know, he said quietly. But you don't have to be strong alone anymore. Maya reached up to squeeze his hand, her engagement ring catching the fluorescent light. I know, she smiled. That's what scares them. Later that night, Marcus sat alone in his apartment, reviewing his notes from the day. The latest anonymous letter lay on his coffee table, its hateful words a reminder of the challenges ahead. But next to it sat an old photograph, one taken at a civil rights march decades ago, where his own parents had stood proud and determined despite the hatred they faced. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. Hello, Antoine. It's Marcus. Remember that favor you owe me? I need you to dig up everything you can on the St. Augustine Memorial Hospital board members, and I mean everything. The storm clouds were gathering, but they would face them together. After all, Marcus mused as he settled in for a long night of research, justice wasn't just about the law. Sometimes it was about standing with those you love, protecting them however you could, and believing that love would ultimately win over hate. Above the city, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human drama unfolding below. But in offices and homes across New York, people were making choices, to love, to fight, to stand together against the darkness. and in those choices lay the real hope for justice. Chapter 7. The Secretary's Mission. Moonlight filtered into the grandiose chambers of the courthouse, its soft glow casting fleeting shadows over the polished wood furniture. Marcus Washington, armed with a clipboard, his favorite bow tie, a particularly audacious paisley pattern in shades of emerald and gold, and a singular mission, leaned back in his chair with an air of quiet determination. Around him, the echoes of his well-ordered plans seemed to hum faintly, a symphony only he could hear. Operation Family Reunion, Marcus murmured under his breath, the corners of his lips quirking up in the beginnings of a mischievous smile. For weeks, he had observed the strained interactions between Maya Johnson's parents and Ruth Ginsburg, noting every hesitant smile and clipped exchange. To Marcus, who had turned the art of reading people into an almost scientific endeavor, the tension was as glaring as fluorescent lights in a romantic cafe. "If I've learned one thing in this courthouse," Marcus muttered to himself as he tapped his pen against his notepad, "it's that even the most immovable objects can shift if you apply the right pressure in just the right spot." He glanced at his clipboard, a document that detailed his carefully orchestrated maneuvers. Each step of Operation Family Reunion was meticulously planned, a series of coincidences designed to make Patricia and Reverend Marcus Johnson see Ruth for who he truly was, not the imposing federal judge, but the man who loved their daughter deeply and unconditionally. Marcus leaned forward, picking up his phone to make the first of many calls. He was pulling in every favor, calling every connection, and strategically leveraging his unparalleled network of contacts. The plan was unconventional, perhaps even a little risky, but Marcus knew it would work. It had to work. The accidentally intentional encounter. Reverend Marcus Johnson stood at the altar of his church, a beam of morning sunlight catching the silver streaks in his neatly combed hair. His sermon that day had been particularly moving, an eloquent meditation on forgiveness and the courage to see people for who they truly were, rather than who you believed them to be. As he finished his benediction, the congregation began to stir, murmuring softly as they gathered their belongings. It was then that a courier, harried and sweating slightly despite the cool autumn air, burst through the grand oak doors. "Reverend Johnson?" the courier asked, holding a large, carefully wrapped package. "Delivery for you." The Reverend frowned, stepping down from the altar. "I wasn't expecting anything," he said cautiously, accepting the package. The package bore no identifying marks, save for a small note tucked beneath the ribbon. He pulled it out, his brow furrowing as he read aloud. "Sometimes wisdom comes in unexpected forms. With all my respect, a friend." Inside was a first-edition copy of Maya Angelou's letter to my daughter. Patricia, standing nearby, gasped softly, recognizing the book at once. It was one she had mentioned in passing years ago, lamenting that she had never been able to track down a first edition for her collection. "How?" she began, but the courier had already disappeared, leaving the Reverend and Patricia to exchange puzzled glances. Coffee and courtrooms. The next phase of Operation Family Reunion unfolded in a bustling coffee shop near the courthouse. Patricia had been persuaded by a church friend to visit the cafe, which was conveniently located just around the corner from Ruth's chambers. Unbeknownst to her, Marcus had ensured that Ruth's schedule for the day included an early morning break, something Ruth rarely indulged in, but accepted without question when Marcus insisted it was necessary for his long-term health. Patricia, sipping a meticulously prepared latte, was startled to see Ruth walk in, his silver-streaked hair catching the soft light filtering through the cafe's wide windows. Marcus had ensured Ruth's entrance was as unassuming as possible, yet Patricia couldn't help but notice the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. "Mrs. Johnson," Ruth said, pausing mid-step when he caught sight of her. His surprise was genuine. Marcus had conveniently omitted this detail from his morning briefing. Patricia hesitated for a moment, her fingers tightening around her cup, before finally gesturing toward the empty seat across from her. "Judge Ginsburg," she said with a slight nod. "It seems the city is smaller than I thought." Ruth offered a small smile and sat down. For a moment, the silence between them was palpable, thick with unsaid words and unspoken judgments. But then Ruth leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together in an earnest gesture. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, his voice low but firm, "I know that you love your daughter more than anything in this world, and I know that I may not have been the person you envisioned for her future. But I love Maya deeply. She's the most extraordinary person I've ever met, and my life is richer for having her in it." Patricia's eyes softened slightly, though her expression remained guarded. "Judge Ginsburg, Ruth," he interrupted gently. "Please call me Ruth." She paused, as if weighing his sincerity before finally nodding. "Ruth, I don't doubt your intentions. I can see how much you care for her. But the world we live in," Ruth said softly, "is one we shape with our choices. And I choose to stand by Maya, to support her, to love her, even when the world makes it difficult." It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but as they sat there, the tension began to ease, replaced by something fragile but promising. The Great Debate. The final act of Operation Family Reunion unfolded at the annual Fall Festival hosted by the church. Marcus had ensured that both families would be in attendance, arranging for them to compete in a friendly debate about one of the Reverend's favorite topics, the greatest civil rights speeches of all time. It was a clever ploy, one that forced Patricia and Ruth to engage in a lively exchange of ideas. As they argued passionately about Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech versus Thurgood Marshall's opening arguments in Brown versus Board of Education, something remarkable began to happen. Patricia found herself respecting Ruth's intellect, his eloquence, and his unwavering commitment to justice. Ruth, in turn, saw in Patricia the same fiery determination and love for her family that he admired in Maya. By the end of the debate, as the two families gathered around a table laden with autumnal treats, there was a sense of tentative understanding, a bridge being built, one careful step at a time. As Marcus reflected on the success of Operation Family Reunion, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There was still work to be done, hearts to be mended, and trust to be built. But it was a start, and sometimes a start was all you needed. From his desk in Ruth's chambers, Marcus penned a quick note to himself. When in doubt, trust in the power of coffee, books, and a well-placed debate. And as the courthouse settled into its usual rhythm, Marcus allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. Justice, after all, came in many forms, and sometimes it was served with a side of pie at a fall festival. Chapter 8. Breaking Point. The courtroom was packed, its marble halls reverberating with the tension of a case that had captured the nation's attention. Cameras flashed outside, reporters jostled for position, and within the austere chamber, all eyes were on Judge Ruth Antonin Ginsburg. The case before him was one of the most challenging of his career. Allegations of systemic racial discrimination within medical residency programs at a prestigious university hospital. Ruth sat behind the towering bench, his expression impassive yet deeply contemplative. He had spent countless nights reviewing the arguments, the evidence, and the implications of his ruling. But more than that, he carried with him the weight of personal experience. He had lived the consequences of prejudice and seen the strength it took to overcome it, not just in his professional life, but in his personal one. As the attorneys delivered their closing statements, Ruth's mind drifted briefly to Maya. He thought of her determination, her unwavering commitment to excellence in a field where she had to fight for every inch of respect. Her journey had inspired him, shaping the lens through which he viewed this case. But he knew his decision couldn't be swayed by emotion alone. Justice demanded more than passion. It demanded precision, integrity, and courage. When the court reconvened, Ruth's ruling was clear and unequivocal. He declared the residency program's practices unconstitutional, condemning the covert yet insidious barriers placed before minority applicants. His written opinion was a masterclass in judicial reasoning, blending legal precedent with a heartfelt acknowledgement of the struggles faced by those who defy societal expectations. In the closing paragraphs of his ruling, Ruth included a personal reflection. True justice does not merely punish inequity, it strives to dismantle the systems that perpetuate it. It demands we confront our biases and acknowledge the dignity of every individual, regardless of the barriers society imposes. As someone who has learned the transformative power of love and understanding, I urge us all to seek the humanity in one another, even when it challenges our comfort or beliefs. The courtroom fell silent as he finished reading his judgment. Outside, the media erupted. Headlines blared, "Judge Ginsburg's landmark decision paves way for equity in medicine." Across the nation, debates ignited, not only about the ruling but about the man behind it. The Reverend's realization. Miles away, Reverend Marcus Johnson sat in his study watching the televised coverage of Ruth's decision. The camera lingered on the judge's composed demeanor, the quiet authority with which he delivered his ruling. But it was Ruth's closing words that struck the Reverend most deeply. For years, he had clung to his reservations about Maya's relationship. It wasn't just about Ruth's race or background. It was the fear of what society's scrutiny would do to his daughter, how the weight of prejudice might break her spirit. But now, as he listened to Ruth speak of love, justice, and dismantling barriers, he saw a man who shared those fears and chose to fight them rather than succumb. Setting down the remote, the Reverend reached for his phone. It was time to have a conversation he'd avoided for too long. Ellie's decision. Across town, Ellie Sotomayor sat in her office, surrounded by case files that felt heavier than usual. Ruth's ruling had solidified what she had known for weeks. It was time to move on. Watching him grow, both as a judge and as a person, had been inspiring, but bittersweet. She admired him more than ever, yet it was a love she could never express, and one she knew she had to leave behind. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, his trademark bow tie a swirl of bold red and black. "You're really doing it, aren't you?" he said softly, noticing the open application on her screen. Ellie nodded, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. "I need to, Marcus. I've learned so much here, but staying feels too hard. It's like I'm living in a shadow I can't escape." Marcus stepped inside, pulling up a chair beside her. "You're not running away, Ellie. You're stepping into your own light, and if anyone can shine brighter than this courthouse, it's you." His words brought tears to her eyes, but Ellie smiled through them. "Thank you," she whispered. With a deep breath, she hit the submit button, sending her application to a courthouse across the country. Marcus patted her shoulder. "They'd be fools not to hire you, and when they do, I'll be sending you the finest lavender tea to remind you of home." A quiet dinner. That evening, Maya found Ruth in the kitchen of their apartment, chopping vegetables with surprising precision. He turned to her, smiling softly. "Dinner will be ready in 10 minutes. I thought you might like something quiet after the week you've had." She stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "Thank you. I needed this." She hesitated, then added, "I saw the coverage of your ruling today." He set down the knife, turning to face her. "And?" Maya looked into his eyes, seeing the weight he carried and the love he gave so freely. "You were brilliant and brave. I'm proud of you." Ruth pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I couldn't have done it without you. Every step of this journey, you've shown me what it means to fight for something greater." They stood there in the warm light of their kitchen, holding each other as the world outside buzzed with the fallout of his decision. For now, they had this moment, quiet, steady, and full of love. Moving forward. In the days that followed, Reverend Johnson met Ruth for coffee. Patricia, observing from across the cafe, noted the easy conversation between the two men. Though the Reverend's approval wasn't yet unconditional, it was a step forward, a breaking point in his resistance. Ellie's application was accepted, and she began preparing for a new chapter in her career. On her last day in Ruth's chambers, Marcus threw a small farewell party, complete with her favorite pastries and a heartfelt speech about her unparalleled talent. As Ellie hugged Ruth goodbye, she felt a sense of peace. "Thank you for everything, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "Working here has been an honor." "The honor was mine," Ruth replied sincerely. "You have a gift, Ellie. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." As Ellie walked out of the courthouse for the last time, she felt lighter. The world was wide open, and for the first time, she was ready to embrace it. The turning points in their lives had come, each one pushing them toward growth, understanding, and love. For Ruth and Maya, the challenges ahead would be many, but they faced them together, fortified by their bond and the support of those around them. And for Ellie, a new beginning awaited, a chance to create her own story, shaped by the lessons she'd learned and the dreams she now dared to pursue. Chapter 9. A Mother's Heart. Patricia Johnson stood in the heart of her home, her kitchen, surrounded by the faint scent of cinnamon from the sweet potato pie cooling on the counter. Her fingers traced the edge of an old photo album, its leather cover worn from years of love and use. This album, a collection of moments frozen in time, was both a comfort and a reminder of how much her family had grown and changed. She flipped to a page she'd visited often in recent weeks. There was Maya, her radiant daughter, standing tall in her cap and gown on the day of her medical school graduation. The sunlit smile on her face spoke of triumph, of hard work rewarded. Beside it, another photo, a young Maya in pigtails, her small hands on her hips, declaring with all the conviction of a child, "When I grow up, I'll marry whoever I want." Patricia's lips twitched into a smile. Maya had always been headstrong, a force of nature. That confidence, that fierce independence, had carried her through medical school, countless sleepless nights in residency, and now a leadership role in one of New York's top hospitals. Yet it was that same fiery determination that made Patricia's heart ache with worry. The knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts, echoing through the quiet house. Patricia's brows furrowed. She wasn't expecting anyone. Setting the photo album aside, she walked toward the door, pausing to straighten her cardigan out of habit. When she opened the door, she wasn't surprised to see Ruth Antonin Ginsburg standing there. His silver-streaked hair caught the light of the setting sun, and in his hand he held a small bouquet of white lilies, Patricia's favorite. There was a quiet determination in his eyes, the same look she'd seen in her daughters so many times before. "Mrs. Johnson," Ruth began, his voice steady but warm, "I know this is unorthodox, showing up like this, but I felt it was important." Patricia crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Judge Ginsburg, you've got some nerve coming here unannounced." Ruth nodded, unflinching. "I suppose I do. But when it comes to Maya, I've learned that some things are worth risking nerve for." There was a pause, and then he held out the bouquet. Patricia hesitated before accepting it, her gaze softening as she looked at the flowers. She stepped back, gesturing for him to come inside. In the kitchen, Ruth glanced around, taking in the warm, familiar space. The faint hum of a clock filled the silence as Patricia set the lilies in a vase. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "What is it you want, Judge?" she asked, though her tone lacked the sharpness it once held. Ruth met her eyes, his shoulders square but his voice gentle. "I want your blessing. For Maya, for our relationship, for the life we're building together." Patricia's fingers fiddled with the hem of her cardigan. "I've heard you ask that before. Why keep coming back?" Ruth's gaze didn't waver. "Because I love your daughter. I see her, truly see her. Her strength, her brilliance, her kindness. I know what it means to love her, to support her, to face the challenges we'll encounter together. And because I know what you mean to her, I'll keep coming back until you see me not just as a judge, but as a man who wants to spend his life making her happy." Patricia stared at him, her chest tightening. The conviction in his words reminded her of Maya's childhood declarations, of the fiery determination she had carried her whole life. In Ruth, Patricia saw the same fierce love she herself felt for her family, a love that would weather storms and break barriers. Her gaze drifted back to the photo album on the table, to the images of Maya's journey. The little girl who had always dreamed big, the young woman who had turned those dreams into reality. And now, here was Ruth, standing before her, willing to do whatever it took to protect and cherish that dream. For the first time, Patricia allowed herself to see Ruth not as a federal judge, not as a man who'd upended her expectations, but as someone who loved her daughter enough to keep trying, to keep knocking on their door, to keep showing up, even when it was hard. Taking a deep breath, Patricia spoke, her voice quieter but no less firm. "You've got a lot to prove, Judge. But if you love Maya the way you say you do, and if you're willing to fight for her the way she fights for everything she believes in, well, you'll have my blessing." Relief flickered across Ruth's face, though he didn't allow himself to smile just yet. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice steady. "I won't let you down." Patricia gave a small nod, her arms still crossed but her expression softer than before. "You better not," she replied, "because if you do, you'll answer to me." Finally, Ruth allowed a small, genuine smile to break through. Fair enough. As he left, Patricia returned to her kitchen, picking up the photo album once more. She ran her fingers over the image of Maya as a little girl, declaring her freedom to choose her future. For the first time in months, Patricia felt a sense of peace settle over her. Perhaps this wasn't the life she'd imagined for Maya, but it was one that Maya had chosen for herself. And as Patricia glanced at the lilies now brightening her kitchen counter, she decided that maybe, just maybe, it was enough. Chapter 10. Full Circle. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and bright, the late spring sun casting a golden glow over the sprawling garden venue, a perfect day for a celebration that brought two worlds together in a tapestry of love, family, and resilience. Marcus Washington stood in the center of the preparations, his bow tie, a dazzling swirl of gold and white, perfectly in place. Clipboard in hand, he surveyed the scene with the precision of a seasoned general. "Table 7 needs more roses," Marcus declared, pointing dramatically. "And for the love of all things holy, make sure the cake arrives on time. A delayed cake is a wedding tragedy." The venue was a perfect blend of both families' traditions. White lilies, Patricia Johnson's favorite, adorned the pews, while delicate Art Deco touches, a nod to Ruth's heritage, accented the decor. Reverend Marcus Johnson, dressed in his finest clerical robes, stood near the altar, a mixture of pride and emotion on his face. Ellie Sotomayor arrived early, her new colleague, a charming attorney from the West Coast, on her arm. She looked radiant, her smile brighter than it had been in months. "Marcus," she called, waving at the self-proclaimed wedding coordinator. "This is stunning. You've outdone yourself." Marcus gave her a knowing grin. "Honey, you haven't even seen the surprise centerpiece for the dance floor. Stay tuned." A ceremony to remember. As the guests took their seats, the soft strains of a string quartet filled the air. Ruth stood at the altar, his silver hair shining in the sunlight, his usually stoic expression softened with anticipation. His bow tie, hand-selected by Marcus, featured tiny scales of justice woven into the fabric. The bridal procession began, and all eyes turned to Maya. She was breathtaking, her gown a stunning blend of modern elegance and classic detail, her veil edged with lace that had belonged to her grandmother. Patricia walked beside her, holding her daughter's arm with a mixture of joy and bittersweet pride. When they reached the altar, Patricia placed Maya's hand in Ruth's, her own trembling slightly as she whispered, "Take care of her." Ruth nodded solemnly, his eyes full of gratitude. The ceremony, presided over by Reverend Johnson, was a masterpiece of unity. Prayers were offered in English and Spanish, and a passage from Dr. King's Strength to Love was read aloud. Maya and Ruth exchanged vows that left not a dry eye in the garden. "I promise," Ruth said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "to love you, to honor you, and to stand by your side in every challenge life brings." "And I promise," Maya replied, her voice strong and clear, "to love you fiercely, to believe in you always, and to build a life with you rooted in compassion and justice." A celebration for the ages. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the reception began. True to his word, Marcus had orchestrated a masterpiece. Tables were adorned with candles and fresh flowers, the scent of lavender mingling with the warm breeze. A live band played a mix of jazz and Motown, ensuring the dance floor would be full all night. Ellie found herself laughing with her colleague, the weight of the past finally lifting. "Maybe new beginnings aren't so bad," she mused aloud, raising her glass of champagne. "They're not," Marcus said, passing by with a wink. "And don't forget, new beginnings always come with cake." At the center of it all were Maya and Ruth, sharing their first dance to Etta James's at last. The moment was pure magic, the world fading away as they moved together, their love radiating like a beacon. Patricia's toast. When it was time for toasts, Patricia rose, her glass trembling slightly in her hand. The crowd quieted, the only sound the rustle of the wind through the trees. "When Maya was little," Patricia began, her voice steady but thick with emotion, "she told me she would marry whoever she wanted. Back then, I smiled and thought, she doesn't know how complicated the world is." She paused, her gaze softening as it landed on her daughter. "But she knew more than I gave her credit for. Love isn't about where we come from, but where we choose to go together." Her voice broke slightly, but she continued, "I was wrong. I judged when I should have trusted. And I'm grateful to be wrong, because it brought us all here today, to a love that has shown me what courage and justice truly look like." The crowd erupted in applause, and Patricia wiped a tear from her cheek as Maya rushed to hug her. Full circle. As the evening wore on, Reverend Johnson stood near the edge of the dance floor, watching his daughter and Ruth move together in perfect harmony. Marcus sidled up beside him, a glass of sparkling cider in hand. "Well," Marcus said, his voice light but warm, "looks like you were right about one thing." The Reverend, stay inspired. Subscribe now for empowering stories, motivational insights, and updates that fuel your journey. Don't miss out. Click subscribe today.